You've got questions, we've got answers. We have the man to answer them, Jeffrey Levine from Buckingham Wealth Partners. Jeffrey, welcome back to another episode of Ask the Hammer.
Hey, it is good to be with you.
Good to have you. My inbox is full of questions, one of which has to do with the new lifetime tables that folks have to use from RMDs. This question comes from an owner of a inherited IRA and wants to know more about how they should use these new tables.
Sure. So inherited IRA accounts have required minimum distributions, as do individuals who have Roth IRA accounts, et cetera. Now, it's important when we're talking about inherited retirement accounts to know whether these accounts are subject to the Secure Act's 10-year rule or whether they're able to use the life expectancy method, better known as the stretch. Now, for those who inherited prior to the Secure Act, that is prior to the beginning of 2020, they're kind of grandfathered into the stretch. For those who inherited afterwards, the standard rule, if you are a non-spouse beneficiary, is that you would get the 10-year rule. But there are some exceptions to that. For instance, those who are within 10 years of the owner still get to use the stretch. A spouse still gets to use the stretch. Minor children and disabled and chronically ill individuals all still get to use the stretch. So between those exempt individuals, as well as those individuals who inherited prior to the Secure Act, there are still a lot of people using this life expectancy or stretch method. And the way to calculate the RMD for those individuals is that for everyone other than a spouse, we need to remove spouses from this equation for a moment. For everyone other than a spouse, you look at a table called the single life expectancy table once and only one time in the year after you inherited. And you look at your age for that year. So if someone inherited last year in 2021, they realize what age they turn here in 2022. They look at the factor on the single life expectancy table for that year, and then they tear up that table. They throw it in the garbage. They light it on. They never look at it again. One of the biggest mistakes non-spouse beneficiaries use to get the wrong RMD is they go back to the table each year and look at the factor, because that's how owners calculate it, not how beneficiaries do, non-spouses, that is. You look at it once, and then you figure out what your life expectancy factor is. So for instance, let's say your factor was 41.5 the first year you looked at the table. Each year after that, to arrive at your life expectancy factor, you simply subtract 1. So if you were 40.5 the first year or 41.5, you go to 40.5, then you go down to 39.5 the next year, 38.5 the next year, 37.5, and until you hit 0 and you have no more money left in the account. Now, what changed this year is that there are new tables that the IRS put out. Essentially, people are living longer, and the last time the IRS issued these various life expectancy tables was well over a decade ago. So to kind of reflect the changes and the extended life expectancy that we have today relative to when these tables were first published, the IRS revised them and essentially diminished the amount that individuals have to take out of their own account, or in the case that we're discussing here, their inherited account. Now, what makes this particularly tricky, though, for beneficiaries is the way that this is implemented. What a beneficiary actually needs to do is go back in time to the year that the year after they inherited, the year that they would have looked at that table the first time, and pretend that they were using the new that just came out this year, or first used this year, that they had been using this new table the whole time. So, for instance, if someone had inherited back in 2012, they need to figure out, how old was I in 2013? What age did I turn that year? Use that table and then subtract. We're now 8 years in front, or 9 years in front of 2013. Subtract 9 from the amount that they see on that chart. So it's not as simple as just looking up the age you are today. That would have been too easy for us. And unfortunately, Bob, IRS never really makes it that simple.
Yeah. So for folks who have their inherited IRA at a custodian where the RMD presumably is being calculated using these tables, do folks need to worry about whether the custodian is actually making the right calculation?
It's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that follow-up, because when it comes to someone's own IRA, custodians are required to calculate it, or at least offer to calculate it for individuals. Now, in a story for another day, Bob, they don't actually have to calculate it correctly. There are some defaults that they can use that don't necessarily mean it's the correct amount for you. But in general, yes, they have to calculate it. But for beneficiaries, that is not the case. Some custodians will do it if you give them certain information, but many custodians kind of say, hey, we're not responsible for that. We don't want to do it because if we calculate it and do it wrong, then it's on us. And see, it's not simply a matter of knowing your age that you are now and knowing your balance at the end of the year like it is for your own IRA. Because as we just talked about, you need to know the year that that person inherited. So for a lot of custodians, they don't know that. They just know how much the person has in the account. They'll know the decedent's name, but they don't necessarily know exactly when that account was first inherited by the beneficiary. And that impacts the amount that is distributed, because two people who are 50 years old today and stretching distributions can have different RMDs, because if one started and inherited 15 years ago and has been subtracting each year one, that's 15 from 15 years ago, they will actually have to take out more from their account than someone who inherited 2 years ago and is stretching required minimum distributions, who's the same age 50, because of the way it works. Remember, you only look at the chart once, so subtracting one each year quickly diminishes your account relative to looking at that chart each and every year. And so for, again, that's different, right? For beneficiaries, two people, same age, different RMDs. That doesn't happen for owners.
Right. So if you have an inherited IRA at a custodian and you have it set up for automatic RMD distributions in November or December, whenever you have it set up, is it best that you call your custodian and sort of review what's going on just to make sure that they're following the rules, even though you're not liable for mistakes?
Yeah, well, they're not necessarily liable. You are, right? Ultimately, you are ultimately responsible. There's a great page on the IRS website that actually talks about this. And I don't remember the words verbatim, but it essentially says, as the IRA owner, you are responsible for what comes out of your account. It doesn't matter what someone else tells you. So it's ultimately your problem. And that means making sure it's done right. Could be working with your custodian, but I always recommend that people verify with their CPA or their financial advisor. Many advisors have tools that can help verify these things. So double checking your required minimum distribution is important, because, Bob, as you know, any shortfalls here are potentially subject to a 50, that is 50, right? Not 15, 50% penalty on the shortfall. And it would be a total travesty to see dollars lost, that someone worked their whole life and passed down to you. It would really be a travesty to see 50% of some of those dollars lost simply because you didn't take out those distributions quickly enough.
Yeah. Well, I think you've helped a lot of viewers avoid a travesty today. So thank you very much.
Well, we certainly hope so. And if you've got questions, you want to avoid your own travesty, let us know. Give us a shout. Email us here at askthehammer@buckinghamgroup.com. Again, email us here at askthehammer@buckinghamgroup.com. And Bob and I will tackle your question real soon.